My name's Larry Hornak, and I'm the Associate Vice President in the Office of Research in charge of integrative team activities. We look forward to providing you some useful information today and answering your questions as best we can. Before we get started, I'm going to mention a few housekeeping points. This is being conducted as a Zoom webinar, which works a little differently than a Zoom meeting, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with at this point. Here's what you need to know. Attendees are automatically muted and cannot turn on their cameras. If you could, please wait until the end of each presentation to ask your questions, and you can ask them in a few different ways. You can always type a question in the chat and choose whether the question is visible to everyone, only to the panelists, or to a single individual. You can use the Q&A function, which you'll see along the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can use the raise hand function, also located along the bottom of your window. If you do raise your hand, we'll assume you want to ask your question by voice, and we'll call on you by name and enable a microphone while you ask your question. Next, we are recording this session, so be aware that not only are faces and voices being recorded, but also all chat messages, even the private ones. So do be mindful of what you type. We'd love to hear any feedback you'd care to provide about today's session, including suggestions for future topics. The Research Matters Live page on the Office Research website has a suggestion form that you can access through the big red button at the top of the page, and we encourage you to make use of it. You should see the URL for that page on the chat window right now, which is showing up for your use. Finally, if you find this presentation useful, please tell your friends and colleagues, virtually of course. This is a brand new series, and word of mouth will be important to make sure the UGA research community is aware of it. So thank you for anything you can do to help us spread the word. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a full agenda today, and let me give you a preview of what you're going to hear about. So what's showing now is our agenda. You've just heard our introduction. We're going to kick it off with two faculty members who've had experience with the NSF RAPID proposals. We're then going to follow up with Jill Tincher, who's going to tell us a little bit about what she's seeing based on her experience and the difference between COVID-19 funding and what some of you may remember is the ARRA funding back just 2008, 2009, as there are some distinct differences. And then also Marty Bink is going to talk a little bit about the Department of Defense funding priorities that he's seeing based on his experience. And finally, Emily Carpinone is going to tell us a little bit about an update on NIH opportunities that she's seeing. So with that, let's start with Kristen and Jonathan talking a little bit about their experiences with NSF RAPID. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar, again, the RAPID mechanism has been around a bit at NSF, and it's a mechanism for just what it says, for very rapid funding of specific projects. And I think both Kristen and Jonathan have had some success in that. So Kristen, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about what you've done, and then also maybe some key points and takeaways you think faculty should hear in terms of how you were successful.
Sure. So the RAPID mechanism, true to name, the whole process is very rapid. So my experience was, I think it was March 13th, whenever UGA announced officially that students weren't coming back. I started thinking, maybe look into this RAPID a little bit more, because I study telecommuting. So it was a really kind of perfect opportunity. The process is that you submit one pager to the program officer for whichever agency within NSF you're interested in. So mine was the Science of Organizations. We submitted a one pager, I think that following Monday, heard back 2 days later that they wanted to see more. And we submitted our full RAPID grant about a week later, and then it took 8 days to find out it was funded. So it was very rapid. I mean, to get the thing written in that short time, that, obviously that was a lot of work on my part, but the fact that they just review it all internally and gave us the green light within 8 days was really remarkable. And just I'll elaborate a little bit on what the topic is. Like I said, I study telecommuting, so I have a co-investigator at the University of South Florida, and together we were interested in just coming up with some best practices for organizations for remote work, because there's not a lot of good evidence-based research out there. So we made our proposal very, I would say, like practical, much more than I think you normally would for NSF. And I don't know if it's just our specific topic, but my sense was that's kind of what they wanted to see in the rapid grants. So it's a shorter proposal. The project description is only 5 pages compared to 15 for a normal NSF. And we just really honed in on, rather than the specifics of our research design, it was more like, why is this research needed right now? So why should it be funded through the rapid mechanism? What are the key questions that are not answered in the literature, and how we're going to answer them? So we really streamlined it that way, and I think ultimately it was pretty effective. And I should say, that you can get up to 200,000, so they're relatively small grants, but we were able to get just under 200,000.
So Kristen, can you comment a little bit on kind of the dialogue you had with the program directors? Did you, well, first of all, did you know your program director up front and contact and reach out to that individual? And then also, you talked about a 5-page. Was there was a shorter, maybe a synopsis you sent initially, or can you tell us, give them a little more insight into that process?
Sure. So I did know the program officer, and actually we had a conflict of interest with the program officer because she is going to the university of my collaborator. So she ended up sending it to another program officer, which is the one who's in the sociology area. So I did not know that program officer before, but as soon as they figured out who was going to handle the conflict of interest, it was just a single page document where we really just highlighted the big picture. Like we went through the different kind of areas that would go in the project summary for NSF. So we hit on, the basics of what we're doing, and then the broader impacts and intellectual merit within that 1-pager document. So tried to just do a real quick, this is what we're thinking. And I will say at that point, we had the basic idea, but we didn't really have it fully fleshed out, because we were just trying to move as quick as we could to get it out. And one other thing I will say in the process, we were trying to get letters from organizations to say that we, for data collection purposes, because we need people who are working, we were trying to get that letters of intent just to show that we had a viable sample. And it was taking a little bit of time to go through the bureaucracy in various organizations. And we actually pinged the program officer and said, would it be better for us to wait to have more letters, or would it be better to just submit it? And she said, just go ahead and submit it. So I think they really the time is more of the essence when you're talking about, that's the whole point of the rapid.
Okay. And so the 5-pager came after that, looking at that brief synopsis, then they gave you the go ahead to do the 5. So they don't want you to waste your time doing that until you have that concept that they think is a go. Okay.
Yeah. And she didn't give any specific feedback on the 1-pager. She just said, this looks good to us. We'd like to see more. And so then we just went from there.
Yeah, it's the we'd like to see more part, which is the great. Okay, well, thanks. Jonathan?
Yeah. I sort of pride myself on being not a practical person. I do basic research, but my program officer for 21 years called me up and said, encouraged me to put in a rapid. And that was in mid-March. And I wrote it over the weekend and turned it in, and then it was reviewed by a committee within the division I was targeting, which was the Division of Biological Infrastructure. And the proposal went up the chain, went to the committee within DBI, went up the chain, and they first realized that it didn't quite fit. And since I'm not a practical, I'm a basic researcher, it also got shuttled to another division, which wasn't strongly supporting rapids. So my program officer asked me to retool it to basically make the immediate connection with COVID-19, namely make it connected with identifying therapeutic targets for SARS-CoV-2. I did that, and it went to a different program director within the Division of Biological Infrastructure. They asked for a 2-pager rather than a 1-pager. And then the next day, they said, go ahead, give us the full 5 pages. So I retooled the full 5 pages, submitted, and then a week later, I had the funding decision. So by April 1, we had the funding authority here at the university. So the main message that I would give in doing this is that NSF has to operate within given program initiatives. So and it has to fit. And so the first time it didn't fit, the second time it fit fine. And the second, it has to represent an immediate response to the problem. So in both Kristen's and mine, one was the telecommuting problem, and in my case, it was developing therapeutic targets. But that connection has to be there or it won't fly in the internal review.
Very good, thanks. Mike, I think we have a hand raised.
Yes, we have got one hand raised. Georgia McPeak wants to ask a question. Georgia, I am turning on your microphone. Go ahead.
I apologize. I did not have a question. I did not mean to raise my hand.
Whoops.
Excuse me.
That's okay.
So in terms of the, for both Jonathan and Kristen, when I guess this notion of really being able to communicate with the program officer and really specifically having that conversation versus kind of putting it into a, kind of putting it in a black box, that's a key aspect of this, right? Having that give and take. It sounds like in both cases you had that to some extent.
Yes, with both program officers, they gave us a lot of guidance on the construction of the proposal. So putting in the therapeutic targets, that's what they advised me to do. That came from them.
Okay.
So I just rewrote the proposal in that way.
Yeah, I didn't get much guidance on content from the program officer, but certainly I think you definitely want to touch base with them before. And I think it explicitly says that you should submit a one-pager before you move forward.
So how long has it taken? We have sponsored programs folks here too. How long did it take from the time that all that occurred to actually have funds to be able to expend or be able to give authorization to expend funds?
2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, for me it was a month, but I had a human subjects review that held it up.
Okay. Okay. But I guess the bottom line is it looks, well, NSF is interested in moving these funds as quickly as possible too. So it sounds like they even may, on our end, we have to facilitate that, but they really sounds like they do everything they can do to facilitate the process on their end as well to be able to get the funds out. So that's great.
They also did tell me that ours was taking a little longer because it was multiple institutions. So I think there's just a few more complications if you have people outside of UGA involved.
Right, right. Okay. Let's see, are there any questions that our participants have? I don't see any. You guys, Kristen and Jonathan, you've done a wonderful job of explaining it to the extent that it's perfectly clear to people.
We've got one question, Larry, that just came in. Does NSF require preliminary data? Is the question.
The answer is we had preliminary data. And that the first step in this process is to convince the program officer you're talking with that you have a viable plan and that it can be implemented in 1 year. That's the key. And so, yes, preliminary data was critical. We had software. I was going to biological infrastructure. We were part of the project was to develop new tools for analyzing SARS-CoV-2 phylogenetic trees to understand where the virus was coming from. And so we had a substantial amount of prior work in that area. And they also felt it was important that we had samples, real samples from China as well. Those were two key things for going forward.
I actually did not have any preliminary data. So in our case, that wasn't required. But like I said, I think having some evidence that we were going to be able to get people to participate in this study seemed important. And we ended up getting 2 letters from organizations. We had hoped to get more, like 5 to 10, but I guess the 2 ended up being sufficient. And I will also add, this was my first time ever applying for an NSF grant. So it sounds like Jonathan had more of a relationship and experience with it before, but for me, this was the first time and I was still able to be successful. So I feel like for people who might feel a little bit nervous because of that, don't be, you can do it.
Kristen, we've got a question for you. Was this a new area of research for you? And did you have your IRB before submitting?
Yeah, so this is not a new area for me. I've been studying telecommuting for about a decade. So I think that really helped. I was able to show, particularly because I had not gotten NSF funding before, I was able to show, look, I've published in this area, I'm an expert. And so that kind of gave them the belief that I would be able to do this study successfully. And we did not have IRB approval before, just because everything happened so quickly. So as soon as we got notification that they were going to fund it, we got the IRB submitted, and the IRB at UGA was fantastic. They understood that it was a rapid, and they got it approved in just a couple days.
That's great. Yeah, the other thing too that I'll just bring out, just from the times back when I was in NSF, and I think that's still the case, is that there's a strong emphasis on really bringing in new researchers to NSF all the time, right? At whatever stage of their career. So, that there's a lot of things in these processes that, think of the program director themselves. They want to have a portfolio of both PIs as well as work that, that reflects kind of the direction that they want to go in. I know just NSF wide, bringing in more people under the umbrella of NSF funding who may not have had it in the past is something which is looked at and by committees of visitors and so on for different organizations within NSF. So that's a good thing. So, see, do we have any other questions for Kristen and Jonathan? Any other questions from the participants? Okay, Mike, I think, are we?
Nope. No other questions at the moment.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. One just came in. Would any of these researchers be willing to check on a grant?
I don't know what that means. You mean read another one's grant, or?
Yeah, maybe they could clarify the question.
Yeah.
Internal review is the clarification.
Not really. I did it over the weekend. So I gave it Monday morning. I gave it to my program officer. So it was not checked by anybody else, really.
Yeah, are you looking for someone else to maybe put an eye on what you're doing to see if it's got the right? I guess it's still not quite sure of the kernel of the question, but I guess I would, well, maybe just if indeed it's about, polishing something before submitting it for these, I frankly would think it's more important to get the idea out and get it to the program director, and don't worry about making sure it's, got the big polish on it like you would in a normal 15-page NSF submission. It's just it's the opposite of that. I mean, you want to make sure the idea is there, but you want to make sure that it's something that they understand and they can see that it's made, hey, this is something I want to have as part of, my funding portfolio, and have it that way, versus polishing, if that's what you're trying to ask about. Anything else? Okay. Seeing anything, Mike?
Nope.
Okay.
Not right now.
Okay. Well, Kristen, Jonathan, thank you very much. That was very, 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 very insightful and helpful. to hear directly from faculty or who've had success with this. So, okay, let's move on to the next portion of our agenda, and that was Jill. You were going to talk a little bit about the what you're seeing based on your experiences, the differences between the COVID-19 calls and AARA effort back, I guess it's now been over a decade ago.
Correct. Thank you, Larry. Again, my name is Jill Tinscher. I'm the Executive Director of Sponsored Projects Administration. And I think when COVID first came out and the federal government started to announce that they were going to distribute funding for research activities, people like me thought back to ERA funding. And back in 2009, when the federal government decided to give money for American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the federal government agencies put out multiple funding opportunities. There were many, many funding opportunities that were published, and over a span of time, faculty submitted many proposals. I remember at my former institution on one particular day, our faculty submitted well over 125 applications on that day alone. So the federal government was inundated with applications from around the country. Those applications were reviewed and determinations were made to fund. So I expected that the coronavirus funding opportunities were going to work in the same way. The federal government allocated money to each of the agencies, and we stood waiting for each of those agencies to start to distribute many, many funding opportunities. Instead, we saw very few funding opportunities that came out. And so first and foremost, I do want to emphasize that there are funding opportunities that are out there. They've been published by many of the federal agencies. At the end of this session, we are going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus website that UGA has created, where we post those funding opportunities. So there are some funding opportunities that are published. We strongly encourage the faculty to become familiar with them and to submit applications to those as appropriate. But I also think that it is important to understand that the climate today is very different than ERA funding. As Kristen and Jonathan just talked, there is a very significant focus that is on relationships. And we are seeing that the federal government is relying on those relationships in order to make some funding decisions. So both Kristen and Jonathan talked about the role of their program officers, and that role is truly integral. They are identifying viable proposals, and then they are making recommendations to faculty, not only on which funding opportunity their idea is best aligned with, but they're also giving feedback on the type of proposal that their agency is looking to fund, where their emphasis is. So we want to effectively communicate to each of you that your program officer truly is an ally that you want to tap into. They are looking at who the subject matter experts are in the different fields. They're also looking at who has a proven track record. And through those combinations, you know, a subject matter expert, a track record, if you have a viable scientific idea that aligns with that agency's agenda, then there is a good likelihood that you are going to get funding. So as both Kristen and Jonathan said, we encourage you to talk with your program officers, find out what areas those agencies are focusing on, share with them your ideas. They really have a strong pulse of what their agency is funding, why they are funding, and they're here to guide you. So that's the first emphasis. Utilize your program officer because they are an ally. The second emphasis is really consider your colleagues and what your colleagues are working on within UGA, but also what your colleagues are working on at other institutions. Funding is available today, and many people are thinking that that funding is restricted to coronavirus testing and vaccines. In actuality, all of the federal sponsors are looking at so many other aspects. Yes, they're looking at testing and vaccines, but they're also looking at data collection systems and analysis, emergency preparedness, They're looking at developing and manufacturing medical devices, equipment, and supplies that could help in a pandemic situation. They're also looking at ways to reduce risk of transmission, and that could pertain to humans, but it also could pertain to surfaces and materials. So there's this endless list of areas that they're looking at that are really related to the pandemic that extend well beyond testing and vaccines. So we want you to think about that diversity, think about those options as you are considering ideas, but then also build awareness on what your colleagues around the country are focused on. And collaborate where appropriate. Talk amongst yourselves, offer your expertise, because your colleague may be working in a very broad area, but you may have something to contribute. And so we want to share with you one really good example that just recently occurred. A UGA faculty member asked someone in the Office of Research about funding that was available through NIH specific to coronavirus. The PI didn't directly work with coronavirus, and he didn't really want to take up reviewers' times looking at some idea that he had if there were better, more qualified individuals out there. So he was looking for our guidance on what opportunity may exist. He had an idea, and it was a great idea. He had developed a technique for testing with a prior disease, and he was thinking about adapting that technique. And maybe it could help us create a serology diagnostic test that could help in the current situation. Well, the Office of Research had learned that GMA had contacted a different UGA faculty member and mentioned that they were looking for better serology testing specific to COVID. Because the Office of Research now had two great pieces of information, one, a faculty member that wanted to adapt a diagnostic test, and GMA, who was looking for an improved serology test, we put those two faculty members together. They discussed a concept. They contacted GMA. They did a teleconference, and they presented that idea. And immediately we found out that GMA was interested in possibly funding that opportunity. So this is a great example where, had that faculty member not asked the question, hey, what funding opportunities are out there? Had we not known that there was a sponsor out there that was looking to fund that area, had we not linked those two together, we might have missed an opportunity. Now, we don't know if this is going to get funded, but we definitely know that we've attracted the interest of GMA, and there's a likelihood there. So this is just one example. I'm sure that there are many out there, but the emphasis is, as we said, talk to program officers, but also talk to your colleagues. We're not on campus. We're not going to bump into each other in the hallway or in the lab. So utilize email, phone calls, Zooms, whatever means you can to brainstorm ideas and bring those ideas forward to the program officers and to our sponsors. Recognize that if you don't work directly within the coronavirus spectrum, there are plenty of opportunities out there. Recognize that the scope that the sponsors are trying to fund is broader. And so think about it in a broader sense. Don't just think about testing and vaccines. And also don't assume that somebody else has a better idea than you. Every idea is worth pursuing at this point in time. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize is, as it relates to existing research funding that you have today or future funding that you might acquire, consider which institutions are and are not performing on-site research. There's many institutions right now that are limiting their research to essential research only, and other research activities are halted. So we need to be mindful of this, because you may have projects that are underway right now. You want to be strategic. You want to consider what research can be done in a remote fashion and pursue that, focus your energies there. And then you may also want to prioritize the components of your research that must be performed on site so that when your research operation resumes, you're ready to hit the ground and run. But you also want to do the same as it relates to your collaborators. If you've got collaborators on existing projects or future projects, you want to stay in frequent contact with them. You want to understand what work is and is not being performed today, but you also want to know when they're going to be resuming operations and when they're going to be prepared to continue with that research activity that you're working on with them. Understand that those decisions are changing daily. Many institutions may have thought that they were going to resume operations June 1, and they may reconsider, and it may not be until July 1. So be mindful of that as well. All of our research activities have deliverables associated with them. In most cases, an annual progress report, but there may be more concrete deliverables that we have an obligation to meet. While everyone is in the same boat right now, many institutions aren't performing research. We want to be as proactive with our sponsors as we possibly can. In many cases, the Sponsored Projects Administration Office right now is working on looking at projects that are about to end and extending them if we need to. Well, we need to be mindful of that for new projects as well. Are we going to be able to start working on them right away because there's certain activities that we can do remotely versus are we going to be in a situation where work cannot begin until later on down the road? So stay in contact with your colleagues, make certain that you're aware of how their operations are functioning. And if you weren't aware, the Chronicle of Higher Ed recently published an article where they are tracking what institutions are or are not open, when they anticipate opening. And so that's a great searchable database that you can get a pulse on what other institutions are doing. But that doesn't replace staying in contact with your collaborators, having those regular dialogues and making certain that we're planning today's research, but also future research in a proactive fashion. Those were my high points that I wanted to emphasize. You know, talk with your program officer, look at the funding opportunities that are out there, think broader than vaccines and testing. Think about the other pandemic areas that may be applicable to your area of science. And then also making certain that you are touching base with existing and future collaborators to make certain that we're managing research in the best way possible. With that being said, are there any questions that you all have of me?
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Jill, and for that all that great information and also the insights as well. So, are there any questions for Jill? If not, we'll move on, and again, we'll have both Jill and Marty and Emily, and then we can stand for questions at the end as well. So, Marty, let's talk a little bit about DoD and where things stand with respect to them.
Hey, thanks, Larry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marty Bink. I am the Director of Defense and Security Collaborations here in the Office of Research, for those of you who don't know me. So what I want to do is just briefly take a minute and give you my view of where DoD is with funding regarding COVID-19. So by and large, I'm going to echo some of the things that Jill just mentioned. I think initially DoD's science and technology response to COVID-19 was to put a lot of money out for diagnostics and therapeutics. I think that money has been spent, and now the funding in the near term, as well as going beyond, the near term, most of the funding is going to be based on the lessons learned from what just happened. And so we'll see some funding that's going to be on some lingering COVID-19 gaps, as well as how do we deal with the next crisis. So I anticipate there being a lot of COVID-19 related funding coming out of DoD in the next funding cycle, but it may not be, as Jill pointed out several times, it may not be about simply finding, the next vaccine or the next therapeutic for COVID-19. I think the funding areas are going to mostly fall in one of four categories. I think there's still a large push for diagnostics. Again, getting back to the notion of, what is the lingering threat for COVID-19? Obviously, everyone's worried about the potential second or third wave. So being able to rapidly diagnose infection is going to be important. But also with potentially the next infectious disease threat or a similar public health threat as well. So all kinds of diagnostics. What are some new mechanisms for diagnosing things like SARS-CoV-2 or other types of viruses or other types of infectious disease. There is some funding out there right now for diagnostics, but like I said, I anticipate a lot more work in diagnostics to come. And again, that's broadly. So as you think about that, do you have technology? As Jonathan was talking about, he didn't necessarily work in the SARS-CoV-2 area, but he found a way that he could, make his work fit with that requirement. So as you're thinking of, if you have work in a similar area that could be applied to diagnostics, think about some novel applications of your work. The second area is telemedicine. So obviously, one of the things we learned from the COVID-19 outbreak was that we were putting our healthcare workers in harm's way by them doing their job. We know that's always the case, but the Department of Defense especially is looking at ways that they can enhance telemedicine capabilities. And they've always been sort of a leader in telemedicine. And again, this situation simply amplified that need. In fact, if you have thoughts on how some of your technologies or some of your research might apply to telemedicine, let me know as soon as possible. I'm tracking a potential telemedicine announcement. So I'm trying to figure out how UGA might play in that space. And again, when I say telemedicine, that could be areas such as information technology. So hardware, software, algorithms that can be used to track patient symptomology, track disease, and those sorts of things, as well as medical devices and other things that can be plugged into telemedicine technologies. The third, I think, emerging and extended technology area is going to be on data analytics and modeling. Obviously, there's going to be funding for modeling the COVID outbreak, understanding what just happened to us and how it happened, but also being able to mature those technologies so the next time a crisis like this occurs, we can be more ready to bring those modeling technologies to bear on the issue. Now, it's also, in addition to just the disease modeling, I think there's a lot of opportunities for other types of data analytics and modeling as well. Again, this public health crisis that we are still going through, obviously brought up a lot of issues in supply chain and logistics. So, being able to understand those gaps better from, again, a modeling and data analytics standpoint, as well as some of the other kinds of response categories. So again, if you have work or the people who you work with have work in the areas that apply to, the analysis of the system, the supply chain and logistics, there's probably going to be, a lot of emerging work on that. Again, those areas will probably be linked with other kinds of technology areas. So there might be some data analytics linked with perhaps diagnostics or telemedicine or some other areas as well. The fourth area that I think that we're going to see a lot more funding from DoD in is in adaptive or advanced manufacturing techniques. And the best example I can give you is think about the need for ventilators in this most recent crisis. How is it that we brought new manufacturing technologies to bear to rapidly design and deliver, this piece of medical equipment that was needed? And again, in case of DoD, that's not only just being able to go out and buy something off the shelf and be able to distribute it, but it's being able to, say, 3D print a ventilator or whatever the next medical technology, or excuse me, medical device that we need, out in the field. So I think, again, this particular public health crisis has made the Department of Defense really look at how they are able to design and deliver the needed medical technologies remotely and to a very widely dispersed population of need. So again, those sorts of new medical device and new manufacturing and development and design technologies are going to be seeing a lot of funding. So again, those are sort of the four major areas that I am seeing a lot of interest in and anticipate funding in. So again, if you have some ideas about how your technologies or how your research may fit in one of those areas, or you want to get a little bit more information about some of these areas, feel free to contact me, and I will distribute as many of the opportunities that I see coming across the internet. Pending questions. That's all I have.
Thanks, Marty. Any questions?
All right, thank you.
Questions for Marty? Okay. And Emily, why don't you give us some insights into and updates with respect to NIH?
Sure. So thanks, Larry. My name is Emily Carpinoni. I'm in the Office for Proposal Enhancement. And I'll just touch on a couple of NIH opportunities and also provide a very brief overview of some of the services our office is providing right now. So typically, the Office for Proposal Enhancement works to develop large, complex proposals. But in the current climate, we're trying to assist investigators who are interested in COVID-19 funding opportunities. And we're doing that by helping investigators identify appropriate matches for their research. So certainly if you have questions, we'd be happy to help you navigate some of those funding opportunities. And in a much more limited capacity, we are providing some review of proposal narratives for these COVID-19 funding opportunities. Again, that's a bit more limited, but we're happy to help as we can. And in the context of the proposal opportunities that we've seen specifically from NIH, during our last webinar, we spoke about the NIH NOCs and administrative supplements that were being issued. And a critical requirement for these is that you have active NIH funding. And a lot of investigators felt kind of frustrated with this because they had research that was relevant but didn't have active funding. But recently we're seeing NIH release calls for R01s and R21s that do not have this requirement for active funding. They do have specific areas of interest that they were looking for, so obviously it will be important to read through these. But if you're interested in applying for an R01 or an R21 and you don't have active NIH funding, this could be a really great avenue for you. And these funding opportunities are available on the COVID-19 website that Mike shared with us earlier in the chat. And if you have any questions about the solicitations, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions.
Great. All right. Thanks, Emily. I guess I'll throw it open, both questions for Emily, Marty, as well as Jill. And also we have Kathy as well here to answer questions. Hey, Kathy. So again, any questions from the participants? Okay. Mike, why don't you go ahead and could you bring up the page that actually Emily was just referring to, and maybe we'll kind of close with that. And what Emily was referring to, and I'm sure probably most of you have seen, but it's constantly updated, the list of opportunities specific to more broadly, but also specific to COVID-19. The other aspect of that on that page, which Mike is showing, if you look at those the COVID-19 information that's showing there, there's federal funding opportunities more broadly with the CARES Act. The other thing along the lines of what Jill was really stressing, the collaboration potentials too. So yes, if you go here, and at the very top, actually before you scroll, Mike, the learn more. You don't have to click on it, but if you do, you'll see that what that does is that brings you to a portal where it lists researchers who have stated that they're doing work in the area. And again, those you can go on, and I'd encourage Jonathan, if he's not already on there, and also Kristen to put their names on there as well. It started as a list of individuals who were seeking on-campus access for the work that they were doing, but now it extends even beyond that to modeling work where people are doing it off campus and others. So it's really a great opportunity for people to network, reach out, contact these people. Again, these are some of the projects. If you look at the next page down at the bottom, there's actually email addresses and other things for individuals too. So I just want to point that out. There's also a Slack channel access that you can find there as well. That there's communications going back and forth by some folks if your labs and your groups use Slack as a communication mechanism. So again, great access for collaboration along the lines of what Jill was talking about. And then, again, a variety of other opportunities that, again, I know Mike and his team are working with Jill, Kathy, and Emily are as they're hearing of different opportunities. Those are constantly posted there. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact any of us in this regard. So again, I just kind of want to thank folks again for joining us today. We hope that you found this information, both informative and also engaging. And again, if you need, to refer back to it, the session, as I mentioned earlier, was recorded and is going to be posted to the Research Matters Live website within a few days. So also we had asked about making your suggestions. So please do make use of the suggestion form on the page if you'd like to provide any feedback, as well as spread information about this Research Matters Live mechanism to your colleagues and friends, and also any suggestions you have as to topics and other areas that you feel would be very valuable. As a reminder, our next confirmed Research Matters Live will be held next Friday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. And the topic's going to be navigating Science CV and ORCID ID. And the speakers are going to be Kathy Cuppett and the Director of Sponsored Programs Pre-Award, and Tammy Childs, the Grants Officer and Sponsored Projects Pre-Award. So we hope you can join us for this session, which is going to be quite helpful for those of you who plan on submitting NSF proposals anytime after June 1, where these elements are going to be integral parts. So thanks again, and from the Office of Research, and we hope that you have a great day.